20-somethings in our culture, only about 62% would say, I believe in God and I believe in Jesus Christ. What I would like to suggest this morning is there is a strong bias in our culture against having faith in God. And it's the young somethings that we need to be talking to, encouraging, and sharing, because I believe with each passing year, they're more and more inundated with a bias that's gotten more intense over the last number of years. Because when you ask the average American, only 3% would say, oh, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. And it sure seems like in terms of the message that's in our culture, the message that permeates our media, you would think there's a lot higher percentage than that. And so that kind of leads us to the challenge that we live with today, is that there are a number of folks I would call practical atheists, or you can call them deists. The idea is, oh, sure, I believe in God. It's just that He's out there somewhere, and I'm over here doing my thing, and there's no real connection. There's no real impact. There's no difference. There's no intervention of God in my life. I'd like to suggest that when you have an opportunity to visit with folks that might be coming from that background, that at least in my limited experience, a large percentage of the time, those that we might call practical atheists, or those that are like, yeah, sure, God, but don't bother me with it, are often people that are dealing with hurt. They have experienced something, they have been frustrated, let down in some way, disappointed. And basically the premise goes something like this: God didn't answer my prayer, or He didn't intervene, or He let this happen. So God, you don't care about me? Guess what? I don't care about you. Whether we articulate it quite that way or not, that's one of the reasons that people begin to drift, and that's founded on an expectation that God is going to do whatever I ask Him. So when you talk about someone who says, yeah, I'm not sure about God, you might take a breath, because they may be coming from a place where it represents hurt or disappointment in their life. And so in this conversation, last week we talked about the 747, and we said, a 747 is so impressive that when you see it, you recognize design. You're like, wow, somebody really put that together well. You would never conclude that a 747 just happened, right? With all the dials and switches and buttons and lights, and the fact the thing can fly, you'd be like, wow, that was really well put together. But you also would notice not only intelligence in terms of its design or its origin, but you also recognize intelligence in terms of its operation. So you wouldn't go to the chain link fence at Dallas-Fort Worth and say, oh boy, it's time for the annual spring migration of 747s from Europe. It's my favorite time of year, right? Because you know they're only there because somebody is deciding where it goes and how it goes. And so we talked about that if I said to you, oh, a 747, it just happened, and then they just decide to migrate to weird places, you'd be like, you're crazy. And yet, at the same breath, we're told that a monarch butterfly just happened. It just happened. And not only did it just happen, but for some reason, the monarch butterfly decides that it's going to migrate from Mexico to Canada every year. And that it's going to take 4 generations of butterflies to make that migration and back. And they'll come back to the same area, often the same tree that their family's been coming to for years, even though no single butterfly has ever made the trip, because it takes 4 generations. Oh, but that just happened by accident. And so we could look at an airplane and go, wow, that was really well put together. But we look at a butterfly and say, what a happy accident. The psalmist says it this way in the 19th Psalm, in the first verse. He says, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. The psalmist says, just creation itself is saying, wow, look at the magnificence of God. Just, wow, you talk about really well put together. But that's a first place, or that's a starting place, because drop down to verse 7, if you will, because here's the rest of the story. Because the psalmist says, the law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The psalmist says that creation says, look at the size of God. But it's God's word that fills in the rest of the story. Because how am I supposed to live? What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning for life? How should I live or order my life? I only get to do it once. I'm not going to be able to learn that from the butterfly. I won't be able to learn that from the stars. And so the psalmist says that creation says, look at how magnificent God is, but I need His Word to fill in the rest. Now we live, like I said, in a biased culture and a biased world that says that science is about thought and about reasoning and about intellect. And then religion is for those that need to lean on something. That religion is about being uneducated and backwards and hillbilly-ish, if you will. And that's okay if that makes you feel better. But true knowledge is about science. And so my purpose this morning is just to do one thing. I just want to get us to back up a little bit with the omniscience of science, because that's the way it's presented. For example, we all know that global climate change is settled science. Now that's a phrase I've only heard the last few years, settled science, which is a way of saying, you got to believe what I believe because it's the only truth. It's settled science. This is from the same voices, though, that tell us, you got to understand that millions of years ago, we went through one or two great ice ages. Everybody remember Scrat the squirrel? Remember him? You know, all that stuff? Well, wait a minute. That sounds like global climate change to me. At the same time that we're talked to about global or settled science about climate change, we're also told that gender is a matter of identification, of emotion, that it's not biology. That's not settled. It's not a matter of chromosomes. It's not a matter of anatomy. It's more about how you feel. Because if you think gender is just male and female, then you're being binary. I don't know about you, but I'm like, wait a minute, I don't want to be binary. All that means is, there, in some choices, there's either a yes or a no, an on and an off, or a black and a white. It's like saying, so are you expecting a baby? And your answer is, kinda. No, that's a yes, or that's a no, right? Or you could go with, I don't know, but the answer is a yes or a no. So there are things in life that are binary. When you go to math class and they say, what's 2 plus 2? And you're like, I'm feeling 5-ish today. No, it's 4. Well, that's binary. Yes, it is. There are places where observable facts are just that. So when we come along to the discussion now, not just of creation, but there's this pressure about, believing, you really going to believe this old book? You're talking about, it was written a long time ago for different people, lived in a whole different world. You got to understand, they traveled by horseback, and if they had the wagon wheel, they were excited. So how does that apply with all kinds of smartphones and texting and a whole different world? Do you feel like there's a bias? That to read this or to really bank on this, you're sort of stretching. Well, let me ask you to consider a couple of things. Stephen Hawking, who passed away recently, was considered an absolute prominent scientist. And he says this. He says there is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, do it because I said so, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. So, can you hear the bias? Religion is just people telling you what to do. But science is about observation and reason, what you can see and then what you can measure, what you can think through. So with that in mind, we're also told about our universe. We're talked to about stars, and there are millions and billions and billions of stars. Then we put the Hubble Space Telescope up, and we got out of the Earth's atmosphere, and we found a whole bunch more, just stars everywhere. And then they talked to us about how these stars are millions and billions of light years away. In fact, the closest star, that, as far as we know, is called Alpha Centauri, 4.3 light years away. So when you're talking the distances involved, you got to use a standard of measure that you can get the numbers down that are manageable. And so as you know, the speed of light is a little over 670 million miles an hour. That's moving along a pretty good clip. That's 186,000 miles a second, and you could circle the Earth 7.5 times every second. That's how fast light travels. And so when you say, well, the nearest star is this far away, it takes light, the speed of light, it takes it 4.3 years just to get here. But then we're told all these other stars, they're hundreds of thousands of millions and even billions of light years away. The universe is just massive and it's huge and all of that. And it is massive. But what's interesting and what I'm asking you to think about this morning is the way we're presented such information. These are facts. This is settled science. This stuff, well now, that's questionable, okay? But ask yourselves, how do we know how far the stars are from us? Well, it's easy. They got in a spaceship, got a couple of tape measures from Home Depot, stuck them together, and measured them out. I mean, how hard could that be, right? Well, you're talking about distances that are so far that how do they measure? They have to use what's called, these are some of the three, there's some others, but these are kind of the foundational principles. They use parallax, we'll explain in a second. Then they measure the difference in how bright the stars are. And then they talk about how the stars move and whether they can gauge the velocity of the stars as they move. These are some of the factors in measuring distances to stars. But the bottom rung, the basic principle, what they use to calibrate everything else is called parallax. And all that is just a word for trigonometry. Raise your hand if you love trigonometry. Anybody? See? Good stuff. Well, here's the cool thing. We know that we're about 93 million miles from the sun, and we know that through this sort of process. You can measure angles. Because trigonometry, the basic foundation is this idea. If you can get a right triangle, if you have a right triangle, if you can get one side and one angle, you can fill in everything else. Doesn't even matter which side and which angle. If you can get an angle and a side, you can figure out everything else. Pretty amazing principle, a lot of fun. This afternoon when you're bored, have some trig. It's fun. Amen? Now try that in a heartfelt way. Anybody with me? Okay. First service, they were asleep. At least you don't have that excuse. So what we do in this measurement is we try to find a known side and then an angle. So we look at a star on planet Earth, and then we wait 6 months and we look at it again. That way the Earth makes its full rotation, and that gives us the base leg of our triangle, which is the distance from the Earth to the sun. That's the biggest thing we can come up with, the broadest base. That's called 1 astronomical unit from the Earth to the sun. Then we look at this star and we measure the angle, because if we know the base, Earth to the sun, if we can get the angle to the actual star, then we can fill in the hypotenuse or the other part of that triangle and say, here's the distance. That's math, right? Solid. But here's the thing. When we're presented this kind of information, it's true that the math is pretty solid, but the question is about measurement. Because of the distances involved, those angles get so incredibly small. We measure angles with degrees. So if you're standing somewhere and look, if you turn a full circle, that's 360 degrees. But as you get out in distance, those degrees get huge, so you got to split them. So you take that degree, divide it by 60, now you have minutes of angle, not just degrees of angle. But that's really too big too, so you divide the minutes of angle by 60 and you get seconds of angle. And so now you have something called an arc second. So when you measure this star, so just to give you a reference, an arc second is so small, if you were 10 yards away and I held up a human hair, you would be trying to measure the width, the angle of the human hair from where you're standing 10 yards away. Another way to illustrate it is if I went out 100 yards and I made a mark on a piece of paper that was 17/100ths of an inch wide. That's pretty small. And then you got backed up, and then you had a telescope or an angle measuring device, and you were trying to measure the angle of the width of that 17/100ths of a line at a distance of 100 yards. Are you with me so far? Is anybody awake? Isn't this fun? Say amen. This is fun. Yeah. Okay, so that's how big an arc second is. So when you're talking about measuring a star, then our Hubble telescope out in space, the best it can do is about 5/100ths of an arc second. That's the finest angle that it can measure, which is impressive, right? But because of the distances, when you do the math on that, that limits you to an accuracy of only about 20 parsecs, which is about 66 light years. Okay? The problem with that is, even if there's talk about some other satellites and advancements going out to 1,000 parsecs, the ability to measure, the Milky Way, just our little galaxy, is estimated to be 30,000 parsecs. So, back up. Here's all started with, so there are stars that are millions and billions of light years away, and then that challenges, it creates some quandaries, and so how do we've been around all this time and all that sort of stuff. Wait. Did you say the stars were billions of light years away? How do you know that? Because the most accurate distance we can measure is out to 66 light years away. Let's even give it 1,000 years. If the new satellites come through with what they say they can, give it 1,000 light years of accuracy, and you just said billions? See, the problem is you end up living way out in the margin of error, okay? Casey is a numbers guy, right? Casey, do you recognize this device? Does this bring back any childhood memories? It does, okay. This is a yardstick, all right? This is a unit of measure. What I'd like for you to do, it shouldn't take very long, is I'd like you to measure, and you can pick any one, doesn't matter to me. I'd like you to measure the width of a carpet fiber.
Can't do it with this.
You can't do it with this. What do you mean you can't do it? This is a standard unit of measure, is it not? Can you not look at me and say, Mike, I can tell you that the carpet fiber is less than a yard in thickness? Can't you say that? I'm going to keep helping you. You could have even said, it's less than an inch thickness, Casey, right? You could have even said, well, I can tell you it's less than a quarter of an inch, right? And I think this one goes down to an eighth. You with me? So you can say, that carpet fiber is less than an eighth of an inch thick. So is that close? No. But it's all I have, right? So I can estimate. Now, I'm not against science. It's great, and the universe is huge, and it's amazing. And my point is, there's a difference in an estimate and settled science. There's a difference in, well, this is absolute truth, and I'm going to challenge your faith. I can't believe. Wait a minute now. Now, you're trying to describe science as if it's omniscient. And it's not. It's our estimate. And so the problem is, when you're measuring the distance to the stars, is you have the same limiting effect. You're well within the margin of error. How are you going to measure something that small and be precise enough to have a number? Well, we do know it exceeds so many parsecs, and that's a long ways in the speed of light and all that. In fact, this morning, one of the brothers was telling me, did you know that there's a group that's saying they may have discovered a particle that moves faster than the speed of light? I said, I did not know that. He said, well, you know, they're still working on it, but if there is a particle that exceeds the speed of light, then everything that we know based on that theory just evaporated. Because that's supposed to be the constant. So when you use parallax and say, you know the star is this close, the problem is you run out of measurement. And that's why they go up the rung. They say, well, then we also compare the brightness of stars. So we see this star, we measure it, we know it's this far away, it's of this brightness. And then there's another star over here that it's dimmer than that one, so based on its brightness, we can estimate its distance. The problem with that is you go from dim to dimmer, right? Because the star that you're measuring that's become your standard, you're using parallax that's past 66 light years, so you're already in the margin of error when you set your standard for luminosity, right? But then when you talk about brightness, we could get on a tower with a good telescope at night and you could see the lights of Lubbock, couldn't you? And you could kind of measure that brightness and go, you know, the average street light is so many watts, or the average radio tower light is so many lumens of brightness. And then you could use that as a standard. You can move around and say, okay, Big Spring, based on that, it's this distance. That's pretty cool, unless you were doing it Friday. You couldn't have measured your shoelaces on Friday because of the dirt. So the problem is, yeah, that's a great idea, but that's the speed of light measured in the vacuum of space. What if there's dust? And we know there's dust in space. We also know that light is affected by gravitational pull, black holes, all that kind of stuff. You can bend light, you can slow down light, you can speed up light. So in other words, when you're saying that, you're like, well, now that's an estimate. And that could be. But don't tell me it is, unless you've gotten your Home Depot tape measure and you've run out there and checked it. Because measured science is the ability, because Stephen Hawking said, to observe and reason. Right. So if I can lay a yardstick up against it, that's observation. But if I can't, that's speculation. And there's a difference. Well, that's not the only thing we could talk about in terms of measured science. My whole point is just back up a little bit, just draw a breath and go, whoa now. This is an estimate, it's an assumption, it's a theory, and that's fine. That's what's fun. But there's also something called historical science. So we have a guest with us this morning. His name is Ethan. He's from Sweetwater, and I'm going to see if he can do a little better than Casey. Okay, I'm going to give you your tool. All right, so here's a rope. And what I would like you to do, I'd like you to make a few general observations. With what you have, what can you tell me about this rope?
Long
Okay, it's longer than a yard. We could probably measure the width of it, right? We could probably count strands. We could note the color. Let me let you hold the rope. Okay, what did you notice about one end?
One end is burned.
Okay, it's been cut. Okay, so based on that, I'd like you to use a yardstick. And here's the question I have for Ethan. He's got the rope in his hands. This is tangible. He knows it's been cut. Ethan, based on what you have, how long did that rope used to be?
Did it used to be?
Yeah, originally. Before it was cut.
Definitely longer than this.
Okay, longer than this. That's a good estimate. Okay? So the problem is, and again, I love science. I think it's fantastic. Science is what you can observe, what you can measure, what you can repeat. But when you talk about applying science to origins, there's a fundamental problem in I wasn't there. I don't know how long the rope was originally. I can tell you what I'm looking at, and I could measure it, and we could talk about it in tensile strength and all that sort of stuff. But I don't know. Part of it's missing. And so trying then to measure the past poses some significant challenges. So can I really trust the Bible, this book that I have in my hand? Well, if you're interested in going further with this, you can go on our website and look at the sermon series called The God Questions, and this is there in more detail, or you can look at these slides in the website in a day or two. So let me just throw some things at you. Here's the manuscript evidence of some of the oldest writings known to mankind. You've got Caesar's writings, Aristotle's writings, dates of when they were written. But the key I want you to see is when they were written versus the oldest manuscript, all right? So like you look up at Caesar, for example, he wrote his memoirs, some other things. Let's just round it off. So let's say 75 BC, okay? The problem is the oldest copy we have of what he actually has written is from about AD 900. What that means is there's like 1,000 years between when he wrote it and the copy that we have in our hand. So when you say, well, this is what Caesar said, well, now, maybe, because I got 1,000-year gap where things could have changed. How would I know? All right? And so when you look at old literary works, writings, this is sort of a normal study. And so when you think about that, let's compare the New Testament by the same standards. And so we could use the best competitor. Homer, his written work, the Iliad, was written about 900 BC, and we have a copy from about 400 BC. That's impressive. That's old stuff. And it has a 500-year gap between when he wrote it and this copy. And that's the best literary evidence of any ancient manuscript. And nobody challenges, like, well, who knows about Homer? And we have like 643 copies of it. And that is stellar. That is stellar. There's not a lot of debate and discussion about Homer's manuscript. What about the New Testament? Well, by comparison, because the first books of the New Testament are written somewhere around AD 50, maybe AD 60. The last one, to round it off, is at the end of the century. So AD 95, 98, somewhere around there. And so we have a copy of the New Testament document from AD 125, which means you have a 25-year window. And by the way, how many copies do we have? At last count, we have over 24,000 cataloged manuscript copies of the Bible. There's more than that that are still in shelves and still in Tupperware-type containers are still going through. The Bible has more manuscript evidence than any other literary work in existence by far, like way more. We also could talk about what we call scientific foreknowledge. This is a quick chart. I know you really can't see it very well, but it's examples how the Bible says things. It's not a science book. That's not God's purpose, to tell us the periodic table of elements. Whew, good. His purpose is to tell us how to live in a way that we live forever. That's the purpose. But when it touches on the subject, it's spot on. So in the book of Isaiah, when the Bible is described as a sphere, that's the day when everybody thought the world was flat, and some YouTubers today. But why didn't the Bible just say it was flat? Or why does the Bible say that life is in the blood when we didn't discover that until just the last century? So there's things the Bible mentions that's like, wow, how would people then have known that when nobody around them would have believed that? Scientific foreknowledge. This is probably my favorite. If you're a mathematician, I'm not, but the numbers are impressive. There are over 300 prophecies concerning Jesus Christ, about 332. So what are the mathematical probabilities of somebody fulfilling those prophecies? Now, some of them you might have said, well, you carry around a clipboard and like, oh man, I got to get these things done. But some of the things are absolutely something you can't go back and do. Like, are you born of the tribe of Judah? Were you born in Bethlehem? Were you raised in Nazareth? That sort of stuff. Somebody fulfilling 8 of these prophecies, the chances are 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's 10 with 17 place zeros behind it. That's a big number. In fact, if someone could fulfill 48 of these prophecies, it would be 1 in 10 to the 157th power. Jesus fulfills all 332. But if we just took 48, it's 10 to the 157th power. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't even know what to do with that number. I have no idea what that looks like. So, just by comparison, do you know how many atoms are estimated to exist in the entire universe? I'm talking atoms, not stars. Atoms. About 10 to the 66th power is the estimated number of atoms in the universe. The number for 332 becomes absolutely amazing. See, when we talk about faith, faith is about trusting. So when you talk about science, do I have faith in science? When it comes to rocket science, absolutely. It's incredible that in the 60s and 70s, they got slide rules out and they figured weight and thrust, velocities, vectors, shot people to the moon, slung them around the moon. The Earth's moving, the moon's moving, they're moving, and got them back. Wow. Can we just say wow? So, when you're talking about, because that's something, they got their slide rules out and said, well, let's do the math. And when they do, there it is, right? Science is impressive when it comes to sending somebody to the moon or sending a 747 across Asia or how many BTUs are in a barrel of crude oil or whatever all that stuff is. Absolutely. But when it comes to origins, where'd we come from? Purpose, why are we here? Science doesn't have anything because they've run out of yardstick. The Bible, on the other hand, has a long track record of trustworthiness in its manuscript evidence, scientific foreknowledge, the prophecy that's been fulfilled, its historical accuracy. The Bible takes huge risks. It names particular people, places, titles, positions, all that can be fact-checked, and all of them have been found to be historically accurate. I guess the bottom line simply is this: whether or not you have enough faith to be an atheist. Because the truth is, folks, neither one of us were there. Neither one of us were there. And so what we're left with is, well, where did it all come from? Because this is what we've been given, and now we're trying to answer this part of the question. And neither one of us were there. The psalmist says that God has revealed himself through what he's made, that we can stand back and go, wow, that is really well put together. So that we can then look at his word and say, oh, wow, that's really well put together. The God who did this knows what he's talking about when he talks about this. So this morning I just want to encourage you. You are bombarded by a heavy bias. That to seriously believe this, you got to be some sort of uneducated drone. Back up and ask the question, wait a minute, how do you know how far the stars are? How do you know that particular thing is that old? Were you there? No? Got any photos? How's your tape measure? It's not saying that science isn't a beautiful thing, but the assumptions that lead us to try to answer the purpose in life, it's not enough yardstick. There's only one that's been there and back and has told us how to follow him, and that's Jesus Christ. This morning we want to encourage you in your faith, strengthen you in any way that we can. We invite you to one of these front pews that we can pray for you as a whole family. But I don't know where you are in your walk with Christ exactly. And so maybe you're in a little different place. Maybe that's just, I need to take the next step, but I'm not sure what that looks like. When you go out in the foyer on the left, there's a table there that says the next step. And there you can visit with us and say, I just need to, and then we want to walk that with you as well. If we can encourage you in any way this morning, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing.
Nearer, still nearer, close to thy heart. Draw me, my Savior, so precious thou art. Fold me, oh, fold me close to thy breast. Shelter me safe in that haven of rest. Shelter me safe in that haven of rest. Nearer, still nearer,